I want to talk about an argument I hear a huge amount from Catholics who argue that Scripture alone is an unreasonable position to maintain, and quite simply the argument goes, how can you claim to know what is the right interpretation of Scripture? Who are you to make that call? Clearly, you need an earthly authority to tell you the correct interpretation. This argument might be paired with the claim that there are 30,000 Protestant denominations, showing how allowing every person to interpret the Bible for themselves is an unmitigated disaster, and again, that there needs to be an earthly authority to tell everybody the correct interpretation of Scripture. The most obvious issue with this argument is that it's internally contradictory. If we need an authority to interpret Scripture for us, then we need to be able to know which authority we should choose. But how can you posit that we have the ability to choose the authority that interprets Scripture, but don't have the ability to interpret Scripture? Why not just switch out the middleman? But for now, I'm going to put that to one side and point out that even just in our everyday regular conversation, we rely on our intuition to interpret things. You watching this video right now are hearing the words I'm saying and using your brain to work out what I mean. You don't need to find some authority to interpret what I'm saying. Functioning every day in the real world demands that we assume that we have the ability to actually understand what people mean when they say things. To this, a Catholic might say, well, that's different because this is about something really important. Religion is serious business. So in that context, you can't just rely on the idea that you have a general ability to tell what people mean by things. This is potentially about eternal damnation or eternal salvation, so obviously you need an authority. But when you consider that this is about religion, you realize how much more self-destructive this argument is, not only to Catholicism, but to religiosity in general. Indeed, the Catholic in making this argument is arguing as an atheist. Because if you've ever argued with an atheist, they will eventually ask, as indeed would make sense, why it is that you accept Christianity over every other religion on the planet. I don't like this question because it's so broad that I only ever think it's worth giving a very broad response of because of the good reasons to do so. However, sometimes if I give a broad response, then the atheist will ask a more specific question, and the conversation is refined until maybe I'm being asked why I'm a Christian instead of a Muslim. Now, at this point, the argument is only broad insofar as there's so many reasons to choose from as to why Christianity makes sense while Islam is a complete joke in terms of credibility. So let's suppose I make the general argument reminiscent of one I've already made on this channel, that Islam's whole claim of being a progressive revelation advancing on the Bible's message makes no sense, because the Bible just doesn't line up with Islam, and obviously I could give examples of that. But at this point the atheist assumes an interesting role in the conversation. After all, they're not a Muslim. Their goal isn't to defend Islam and argue that in fact Islam is very credible as a further revelation to biblical scripture. Instead, their goal is simply to argue that me holding to a particular religion makes no sense. So they're going to claim that my reasons for thinking Christianity true instead of Islam makes no sense. And how are they going to do this? Well, they're going to say that I can't know that I have the correct interpretation of the Bible because Muslims would disagree. Sure, I might think it's obvious that Jesus is God from reading the Bible, but lots of Muslims wouldn't think that. The atheist problem is that for me to hold to a religious point of view, I need to have the temerity to say that I have enough of a good idea of what Scripture is saying that I can argue against other religious claims based on that. Are you starting to see the parallels yet? This is one reason why I can say that me becoming a Catholic is basically an impossibility. Not just because I'm saved and I can't lose my salvation, so it's unlikely I'd convert to a false religion if I can't lose my salvation. That's not to say it's impossible that saved Christians can go so off track that they even end up converting to false religions, but it's very unlikely and would require a lot of cognitive dissonance. The reason I could never be a Catholic is because the main argument for Catholicism is that you can't interpret Scripture for yourself, but my interpretation of Scripture is how I came to be a Christian in the first place, and Catholics claim to be Christians. If I didn't think I had the ability to actually look at Scripture and discern what it was saying, I don't know how I possibly could have come to be convicted by it. A Catholic might say that this is because my reasons for becoming Christian are in some way illegitimate. I became Christian through, as an atheist, learning the message of the Bible and finding it persuasive. But maybe for a Catholic, that's not the right reason to become a Christian. In that case, I'm not sure what the right reason is. But whatever the reason is, even if we're not talking about interpreting scripture, we're still talking about interpreting reality and interpreting arguments and using our basic intuition to come to conclusions about what's true and what's false. If this is not how you come to believe something, then you don't really even believe that thing. What Catholics are asking is that people use their intuition and their ability to interpret things accurately in order to come to the conclusion that so-called Nicene Christianity is true, and then completely abandon the idea that they could possibly accurately interpret or intuitively evaluate a truth claim so that they can surrender themselves to the authority of the Catholic religion, because the Catholic religion can interpret scripture, and we absolutely can't hope to. Considering how internally contradictory this all is, and how it basically denies that human beings have the ability to know what is true, it's unsurprising that most people convert to Catholicism for vibes reasons, political reasons, or because of violent persecution. Very few people become Catholic through logic and reason, and no internally consistent person does, because they'd have to then reject the idea they even possess logic and reason when they accept that they have no ability at all to interpret scripture. I also shouldn't leave it unsaid that there isn't just one Catholic religion. There's also the eastern branches of the Catholic religion, and they make similar claims about how individuals aren't able to interpret scripture for themselves. So even if you become Catholic and you accept that you have no ability to interpret scripture for yourself, you now have to choose which branch of Catholicism to accept. Again, it seems obviously internally contradictory to think that you can't interpret clear text on a page with your own reasoning, but with your own reasoning you can decide which so-called apostolic church is the correct one to interpret the scripture that you yourself can't interpret at all. It's like somebody saying that you can't possibly understand quantum mechanics and come up with your own way of explaining it, but you must pick which theorist's explanation of it is true. That makes no sense. In reality, what you should do in almost all areas is keep an open mind, listen to all the viewpoints and arguments, and then use your own brain, which you've hopefully honed to be logical and consistent, to work out what's right for yourself. And honestly, in the case of the most important things about the Bible, I don't think this should be that difficult for those who aren't willfully spiritually blind. All I did was listen to arguments and consider how much sense they make, and I'm happy to say that I'm as near as 100% certain as you can be about anything that Catholicism is a false religion. It's really not that hard to realize this if you read the Bible for yourself. One final thing before I go, the Catholic Church claims to be the only church with the authority to interpret scripture accurately. With this in mind, do you know how many passages of scripture they've officially interpreted? 6. 6 passages. They'll say that they've implicitly interpreted scripture by ruling on all sorts of other issues, but how can the average plebeian actually apply those rulings to scripture themselves? I thought we weren't allowed to do that. They've said that people can't interpret scripture for themselves, and then haven't even been bothered to tell them how it should be interpreted. Catholicism has huge amounts of resources and a lot of people whose whole job is just centered around pontificating. You'd think in the 1700 years they've been around, they'd have had time to produce an official Catholic interpretation of scripture. Although even if they did, wouldn't that be pushing things down the road? How could the average person accurately interpret the Catholic interpretation? What if two people argue about what the Catholic Church meant? Does the Catholic Church have to produce an official interpretation of their interpretation? This really is a stupid system. It's hilarious that they think the variety of thought in actual Christianity is some big issue, when it really doesn't bother us at all. Meanwhile, it's their religion that's a complete mess. So why is it that Catholicism claims that nobody else except them can interpret scripture, but then they don't actually interpret scripture? It's because, and I hope you don't need me to point this out, their goal isn't to interpret scripture, it's to stop scripture being interpreted, because the only way an honest person can interpret it would lead them to conclude that Catholicism is a wicked false religion.